All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today we're taking on a bit of a masterclass to demystify something absolutely crucial in the ICU, mechanical ventilators. These are incredibly complex machines that literally keep patients alive, and we're going to build up your understanding step by step. We'll start from the very ground up with the foundational physics of how air actually moves, then map out the ventilator's control panel, and eventually work our way up to advanced troubleshooting for when the patient and the machine, well, aren't exactly getting along. It's a fascinating look at where biology meets engineering.
Just to give us a quick roadmap, we're going to hit 6 key areas today, starting with the basics of breathing, moving through the control panel and ventilation modes, and finally wrapping up with patient-ventilator dysynchrony and troubleshooting. Okay, Section 1, the basics of breathing and the physics of air. So before we even think about touching a single dial on a vent, we kind of have to ask ourselves a pretty fundamental question. How exactly does a machine breathe for a human being, without causing damage? Because it really is this massive balancing act of pressure, flow, and volume. We have to push air in to sustain life, absolutely, but we have to do it without causing ventilator-induced lung injury. And the secret to understanding how we pull this off lies in one single physiological formula. And that formula is the equation of motion. Now, don't let the math scare you. It actually anchors our entire understanding here. Look at how it breaks down. The total pressure the ventilator generates has to equal the elastic recoil of the lungs times the volume, plus the airway resistance times the flow. In plain English, the ventilator just has to generate enough pressure to overcome 2 things: the stiffness of the lungs, that's the elastance, and the friction in the breathing tubes, that's the resistance. That's what it takes to deliver just one breath. Keep this equation in mind, and honestly, the rest of the machine's behavior makes perfect sense.
Moving right along to Section 2, the ventilator control panel and our 4 main dials.
All right, with the physics out of the way, let's look at the machine itself. Think of these settings as your 4 core controls. On one hand, you've got your oxygenation team, FiO2, which is your fraction of inspired oxygen, and PEEP, or positive end expiratory pressure. PEEP is just that continuous baseline pressure that keeps the tiny air sacs, the alveoli, popped open at the end of every breath. On the other hand, you have your ventilation team, handling the carbon dioxide clearance, respiratory rate, so breaths per minute, and tidal volume, the exact volume of air delivered in a single breath. Oxygenation on one side, ventilation on the other. But here is where we absolutely have to be careful. When you're setting that tidal volume dial, you can't just pick a number out of thin air. Decades of critical care medicine have hammered home that we must use a protective lung strategy, strictly targeting 4 to 8 milliliters per kilogram of predicted body weight. Why so specific? Well, research clearly shows that blasting too much volume into fragile lungs causes devastating ventilator-induced lung injury. Sure, bigger volumes might clear CO2 a bit faster, but keeping it in this tight, smaller range is what actually protects the tissue and saves lives. All right, Section 3, basic ventilation modes, or what I like to call functional recipes.
So, when we mix those dials together, we run right into the classic ICU trade-off. It's an either-or situation. If you choose a volume-limited mode, you lock in the tidal volume, which guarantees the patient gets exactly the amount of air you want. But the airway pressure is going to wildly fluctuate depending on how stiff their lungs are. Flip that around, and with a pressure-limited mode, you cap the driving pressure to protect the lungs from high forces, but now the volume will fluctuate breath to breath. You can control the volume and let the pressure float, or control the pressure and let the volume float, but you can never ever control both at the exact same time.
Which brings us to Section 4, advanced ventilator modes and adaptive support. Okay, so what if we want the best of both worlds? Enter PRVC, or Pressure-Regulated Volume Control. This mode is hugely popular, and for good reason. It's an adaptive mode, essentially a highly intelligent, automated version of volume control. The ventilator's internal computer actually monitors the patient's lung compliance breath by breath. It constantly recalculates to deliver your target volume while automatically using the absolute lowest airway pressure possible. It completely takes the manual guesswork out of balancing pressure and volume. If you look at the pressure waveform for PRVC, you can actually see this algorithm doing its thing in real time. Notice how the peaks of those waves are slightly shifting up and down with each breath? That's the machine sensing that the lungs maybe got a tiny bit stiffer, so it nudges the inspiratory pressure up just enough to consistently hit that target volume marker. It's this incredibly dynamic, ongoing conversation between the software and the patient's real-time physiology.
Let's move to Section 5, when man fights machine, also known as patient dysynchrony.
So, what happens when the mechanical delivery we've perfectly programmed completely clashes with the patient's own neural drive to breathe? Well, we get a very stressful clinical scenario called patient ventilator dyssynchrony. Take a look at that scooped-out concave dip on the pressure waveform. That right there is a classic indicator of flow starvation. It literally shows us that the patient's diaphragm is pulling incredibly hard for air, demanding a faster flow, and the machine just isn't keeping up. The patient is effectively sucking the pressure right out of the circuit. It's exhausting for them, and it tells us we need to intervene right away.
And flow starvation isn't the only issue. By learning to read these specific waveforms, we can pinpoint exactly how the fight is happening. You might see double triggering, where the patient's drive to breathe is so strong they trigger a second breath immediately after the first one, creating these really dangerous stacked breaths. Or you might see premature cycling, where the ventilator abruptly cuts off the breath while the patient is still actively trying to inhale. Every single dip, weird spike, or scooped curve on these monitors is a crucial piece of visual language telling you exactly what the patient needs.
Finally, Section 6, troubleshooting and our clinical algorithms. Because spotting the problem on a monitor is only half the battle, right? We have to actually fix it. So when those high peak pressure alarms start blaring, you need a systematic approach to turn panic into targeted intervention. Your very first step? Check the plateau pressure using an inspiratory hold maneuver. That single move splits your entire decision tree. If the plateau pressure is normal, you know you're fighting increased airway resistance. So maybe the tube is kinked, they're biting it, or there's a mucus plug. But if that plateau pressure is elevated, you're dealing with decreased lung compliance, meaning the lung tissue itself is the issue, like a pneumothorax or fluid filling the alveoli.
And the same systematic approach goes for managing those dyssynchrony waveforms we just looked at. First things first, ask yourself, is the patient's sedation adequate? If it is, then you start tweaking your dials to fix the mismatch. Got flow starvation? Simple, you increase the flow rate. Having trigger issues? Adjust the trigger sensitivity. Breaths getting cut off too early? Tweak the inspiratory time. The whole goal of this workflow is to carefully massage the machine's parameters until the biological rhythm of the patient and the mechanical rhythm of the vent are perfectly synced up again.
Which brings us to a really compelling final thought. We've covered the physics, those 4 fundamental dials, smart modes like PRVC, and the strict algorithms we use to troubleshoot. It is genuinely amazing how far we've come with this tech to protect fragile lungs. But it does leave you wondering, with how fast things are moving in monitoring electrical diaphragm activity and neural drive, are we getting close to a time when AI can actually anticipate a patient's exact respiratory needs before they even try to take a breath? Could intelligent algorithms eventually make fighting the ventilator a thing of the past completely? Definitely something to chew on the next time you hear those ICU alarms going off. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and keep on learning.